And don't bring a thing.
Don't bring a thing.
Sweet.
We have to bring something.
We so do.
Hi, guys.
It's a croquet bush. 30 litres of jelly.
Tastes like chicken.
Don't touch it. How big's your barbecue?
Hi, guys.
Cadbury favourites. What to bring when you're told not to bring a thing.
Who's seen that ad before? Anybody? Yeah, I think it was 2010 maybe. I'd like a show of hands, who's had that conversation before? Yeah, I think most people have. I instantly thought of this when I was thinking of the come to the table. And when someone invites you over to the meal, I feel like there's two responses to the whole, only bring yourself, don't worry about anything, don't bring a thing. You're either the kind of person who takes a big sigh of relief. I don't have to worry about anything, don't have to worry about remembering to bring a dish home, don't have to worry about asking what people's dietary requirements are. You just get to go, have a good time, and go home. Or you're person number two. You get told this, and it's either because of how you were raised, or it's just something you've always done, or it's a cultural thing, but you have to bring something. And I'm sure a croquet bush or 30 litres of jelly is not what you thought, but there are some unspoken rules when it comes to what you would bring. Every culture, whether it's unspoken or spoken, has dinner protocol. Like, you don't add to the stuff the host has to do, like bring a massive leg for them to cook. But then you have to think, what are they actually going to like? We're going to explore another story about Jesus having a meal at a table. And we're going backwards in Luke from last week. But this time we're looking at an uninvited guest and what they brought to the table. So the story has 3 points of view. And we get a little more from some than others, but we experience this story from the eyes of Simon, the sinful woman, and Jesus. And I want to start with what the woman saw because she causes the biggest amount of commotion in this story. She's introduced to us in verse 37 as a woman who has lived a sinful life and had learned that Jesus was dining with the Pharisee. The nature of why she was considered sinful is not disclosed, but many assume that because of the common professions that would garner that title, that she may have been a prostitute. But I think it's left out for a reason. The next verse starts with, as she stood behind him at his feet. She is now at the table. We don't really get any information between who she is and arriving at the table. And I wonder if you thought, how did she just mosey in and land up at the table? I'm sure if someone uninvited showed up at your dinner party, there'd be a few more questions before she arrived at your table. The dining rooms in homes of Pharisees and other elite in ancient Israel were not the same as ours. Dining rooms of the rich, or people like Pharisees, were mostly public areas with wide open arches for the public to stand in so they could view high-profile religious, political conversations. And the conversations usually surrounded controversies or debate around the guest of honour, which in this case was Jesus. So the woman being quite close and having access to Jesus wasn't really that odd. But in approaching the table, she broke a large wall of social protocol and continued to do so in several ways. These kinds of meals were not seated, but the tables were designed to be lounged at. I'm sure you might have seen things like that in paintings before. So the head would be closest to the table and the feet away and kind of lounge towards the table. So as she approached the table, she reached his feet first. She fell to the ground and began to break down. She was crying so much that she began to wet his feet. So she wiped his feet with her hair and kissed his feet. This would be an awkward situation at any dinner table. But in this time, for these unsuspecting hosts, it was particularly more so. The uncovered hair for women in the time was wildly inappropriate and only done in times of great shame or as a sensual act. The public act of affection was seen quite in the same light, so her kissing of the feet was just as inappropriate. And this is how she would have been seen by everyone who was there, the people at the table and the people watching in the public in the arches. But what did the woman see in that space? She only saw Jesus. She acted in a way that seemed to be oblivious to that fact that was everybody else was in the room. She came to that table at a great personal cost, one of those costs being that of the perfume. This was probably the only part of the encounter that she had planned when she came up to Jesus to anoint him. The perfume she poured on Jesus was very expensive. It was often worn in a small vase around the neck on a cord, and it was such a significant part of female attire, and the cost was so well recognised that it was even allowed to be worn and carried on the Sabbath. But also, a great personal cost of public ridicule. She showed great humility in the washing of the feet and kissing of his feet, and great boldness in approaching the table full of religious persons who frankly weren't her biggest fan, but just to see Jesus. In the story, we are also told what Simon the Pharisee makes of this scene. Many of the stories of Jesus sharing a meal with the Pharisees results in conflict about the acceptable role of a host and a guest is supposed to meet. And this meal is no different. It is likely that Simon's invitation did not have the purest of intentions. It is likely that as Jesus continued to grow his ministry and gain followers and the talk got bigger, Simon, as the religious leader, wanted to scope out this man. What is he about? What is he doing? The intent of this meal was already positioned to hear what Jesus had to say about Jewish law. That was the kind of meal that we're at. But it seems that Simon was interested to test the claims that his followers had about this man of authority. As unplanned as this interruption was of the woman, it aided in Simon's want to test Jesus, test his character. Simon's reaction to the woman would have been as the rest of the onlookers, disgusted, shocked. But for Simon, Jesus' response to the scene was just as, or if not so more shocking. Jesus allowed this scandalous act to continue. This confirmed Simon's perception of Jesus that he already had heading into the dinner. Simon's thoughts are shared with us in this passage. If this man is a prophet, he would have known what sort of woman is touching him, for she is a sinner. And I can only imagine the deductive thinking that went on for Simon in this when this happened. But if he knows who she is and she is still letting them touch him, then he still can't be a man of God, because that's just as unacceptable as him knowing and letting it continue. This tells us exactly what Simon sees at this table. He can only see this woman as a sinner. He can only see a sinner and a man who was falsely claimed to be a prophet, allowing it to happen. He could only see this woman as a sinner in complete disregard of the magnitude of her display. Simon could only see what they had not brought to the table. In quite the contradiction to Simon's assumption about Jesus, Jesus already knew his thoughts. Replies to the way that he viewed the situation with a short parable. Verses 41 to 42 read, 2 people owed money to a certain money lender. One owed him 500 denarii and the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he forgave the debts of both. Now which of them would love more? Simon replies with the correct answer. The one who had the biggest debts forgiven. Jesus then shares of the reality of what Simon should have seen in this situation. How the role of the host and the guest was not as he had perceived. Simon didn't fulfill the basic requirements of his role as the host. As a host, it was customary in a sandals to walk everywhere in a sandy kind of city society to wash the feet of your guests before they get to lounge at the table. Offered a kiss over the head and oil placed on the head of the guest. But Simon was so distracted by his intent for that meeting, he didn't do any of that. All these acts of gratitude and honour which Simon had neglected. Not only had he not done these things, but he was too busy shaming the woman who was not only not invited, but who did these things far beyond what was expected. His dirty feet washed with her own tears and dried with her hair, offered kisses to probably still dirty feet, I'm not sure how good tears would go, and anointed with her most precious oil. In this parable, and the confrontation of Simon, that we see how Jesus saw the situation at the table. Jesus saw not just the situation, but the hearts of the individual sitting at the table. He sees Simon not as an evil, ill-intent Pharisee, but as a human being who needed guidance. He saw that because Simon did not view himself as a sinner, as someone who was righteous and morally above everybody else, he could not understand the woman's great display of emotion. Jesus sees the woman not for her sin, but for her gratitude. The woman requested nothing of Jesus, but sought only to honour him, as she had heard about him and had no one left to turn to. Jesus said, "Therefore I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown." She did not show love because her sins had been forgiven in that moment, because Jesus doesn't speak directly to her into the verse after this. She showed great love and gratitude because she already knew of the love and the grace that existed in Jesus. Love not in exchange for forgiveness, but because she was already offered the grace and forgiveness. Her great sins, but also the way others viewed her sin, meant that it was easy for her to understand the magnitude of that gift. Such as in the parable, Simon viewed his debt, his sin, as small, because it weren't as obvious. Therefore, he did not understand the great gift of Jesus' grace. And this is what Jesus saw. So I want to ask you, what do you see when you see this story? Whose eyes do you view it through? Do you come to the table as a sinful woman does, seeing nothing but Jesus, no matter what's going on around you? Are you bringing all that you are, holding nothing back, to the foot of Jesus? Or are you holding something back? Is there a part of yourself that you're ashamed of, that is stopping you from breaking out of the crowd and running towards Jesus at the table? Or do you see this story like Simon does? Does your measuring stick of worthiness lie in societal or religious expectations and protocol? Do you think your sins are only small, therefore missing the miracle that is God's grace? Whatever be true for you in this moment, we must make the first step to be like the sinful woman, be willing to leave behind a life that was, for a seat at the table, a table of grace, a table that sees us as we truly are, a table where our greatest mistakes can be turned into a vehicle for God's glory, a table where there are no uninvited guests. This party is one of those ones where you are told not to bring a thing. The host, our God, does not require anything other that we bring ourselves, our whole selves, to him. But this is also a party for which we are so grateful we cannot help but to bring something. So what are you going to bring? This isn't a prayer that happens overnight. This is one that lasts forever. If all of you means less of me, that's massive. So don't be discouraged by that. Be excited by that. It's something you get to work on forever. I'd like to close our time of worship today with a prayer, so please join me. Creator God, we stand in awe of the table that you set before us, a table of grace, a table of unconditional love. We are undeserving of an invitation to this table, but you sent us one anyways in Jesus. Lord, may we always be bold enough to stand apart in gratitude, to bring even the scariest parts of ourselves to you, for you know what they are already. Bless us as we head into this week, with eyes to see the sweet things of your table in every circumstance. We pray this in your name. Amen.